Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for sticking around after the last panel. You're not going to be disappointed with this one. As I mentioned in the very first panel, if you listened, healthcare was going to be a big subject today, and it's something that frightens everyone, cyber attacks on hospitals. And we've got an all-star panel to listen to from multiple different perspectives. First up is Lynn Sessions, and I have to say, I love Lynn's credentials. Just amazing. You know why? Not just because she's a partner at BakerHostetler who focuses her practice on healthcare privacy and data security, breach response, regulatory defense, HIPAA compliance, and she's handled over 800 healthcare-related data breaches, but also because for 7 years, Lynn served as in-house counsel and director of several departments at Texas Children's Hospital. My dad, uncle, and grandfather were all physicians, so I grew up around hospitals. I know how special the people are. I can't imagine any other attorney having the kind of client perspective that Lynn has when a hospital undergoes an attack. Thanks for being here, Lynn, from Houston, your first incident response forum. We are thrilled you are here. Welcome. Next up is Ashton Fein, a partner at Covington and Burling and also vice chair of the firm's global data privacy and cybersecurity practice. What makes Ashton a cyber expert is not just that he advises a broad range of corporate clients on cybersecurity and national security matters, including crisis management, incident response, risk management, and the rest, but it's also that Ashton served as a military intelligence officer, counterintelligence agent, and later as a lawyer in the JAG Corps, culminating as the chief of the criminal division lawyer and head prosecutor responsible for over 17,000 soldiers, which makes him kind of the Tom Cruise of this panel. And Ashton is one of the more famous lawyers we have here today in that he was the lead trial attorney in the prosecution of Private Chelsea Manning for the leak to WikiLeaks. Given the legions of foreign soldiers that wake up every day with the sole goal of infiltrating US systems and the fog of war characteristics of cyber attacks, a national security expert like Ashton has become essential in so many IR matters. We're grateful to have him today. Welcome, Ashton.
Thank you.
And don't you love it when a lawyer or a CISO just speaks their mind and is not afraid to take a stand? That's Darren Lacey, who's both a lawyer and a CISO, and who has been serving as Chief Information Security Officer and Director of IT Compliance for Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins Medicine for the past 15 years. What makes Darren an expert is not just that he is a Harvard lawyer and a developer, consultant, and executive who has been working in the tech sector for nearly 30 years, a very, very rare combination. But it's also that Darren is a true titan of the CISO industry, not only for his brain power, but also for his candor. He speaks with a level of authority that very few technologists have. 65,000 employees, 50,000 students, and countless patients rely on Darren. So thrilled to have a world-class expert like Darren back and can't wait to hear his thoughts. Welcome, Darren. Next up is Evan Roberts, who will be the moderator of this panel. I'm sorry, Ashton is the moderator, not Evan. Evan is a managing director at FTI who rounds out perfectly this panel. What makes Evan terrific for this panel is not just that his cyber experience runs the gamut of ransomware attacks, large-scale data exfiltration, spear phishing, data theft, or his experience counseling clients through cyber preparedness, but also because Evans is a communication specialist, specialized in particular on the convergence of cyber attacks, ransomware and the like, and public relations and name and shame accounts. For instance, how does Facebook handle the bad PR stemming from the name and shame of the disclosure of personal info of over 533 million users? That's something I just read recently. I'm not involved in it, but I find it really, really challenging to think about how to handle. Think about it if you're in the audience and you work for a hospital and your company's attacked. Do you know who will lead the negotiations with the threat actor? Are you going to choose to pay the ransom? How can you be sure not to antagonize the attacker? How do you tell the world what happened or not tell the world what happened? These are the questions that Evan has handled dozens of times, and his experience is invaluable. So take it away. I hope there'll be lots of questions for this panel. Ashton, let's get started. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John. On behalf of the panel, I want to thank you for the kind introductions. I've always found it quite intimidating participating in the IR forum simply because when I hear your description of my practice and others, I immediately start questioning whether I'm actually that person. But you've established really high expectations. Hopefully I and everyone else can meet them. So I'm super excited to be facilitating today's panel. focus on incident response in the healthcare industry. The healthcare and life sciences industry makes up a large part of my practice, and I routinely find myself advising clients in the industry on incident response and the full range of cybersecurity issues. Of course, cybersecurity maturity can vary widely between entities in any given sector. But one thing we're now seeing with our healthcare clients, both large and small, is a recognition that their data security practices are crucial for continuity of operations and protection of critical assets, whether that's patient data, intellectual property, manufacturing, quality controls for pharmaceutical companies or others. However, as many of us on the panel know and we'll discuss here today, incident response is far more than just a reactive process. Rather, it's an iterative cycle that often counsels in favor of more work on the front end rather than the back end, including employee training, incident response plans, tabletops, and the like. So what I'd like to do is quickly jump into talking about the healthcare industry, and then we'll pivot to perhaps discussing how the pandemic has impacted the industry when it comes to incident response. I thought it would be best to start talking, focusing on the unique threats that the healthcare industry faces. And so for that, Darren, I thought it would be helpful for the audience to hear your view on what's unique about this particular sector that's ripe for threat actors. Like, what are the challenges that are most unique to this industry?
Well, I mean, the main one is that we're just big. We're big in terms of the size of the sector. Our IT application footprints, if you have the misfortune of being in the hospital and you look to your right, you may see a cabinet. That cabinet may have 7 different computers in it, 7 or 8. We have several in our environment where in each patient room there's 7 or 8 different computers, all of them talking to different applications and talking to essentially different different modalities. So we collect so much information so rapidly in so many different ways, and we interface it in so many different ways that typically healthcare organizations, the IT infrastructure, the IT groups, the IT expertise, the people who kind of run the show, their main job has just been trying to think about how all these applications talk to each other. And so we build, HL7, and we build a bunch of other tools to do that. What's come out in the last 10 years, because essentially ransomware and malware attack the underlying IT infrastructures, is that in environments where we mainly thought about applications, we're now having to catch up on the IT infrastructure side. And for the lawyers here, most of the folks here are lawyers who don't deal with IT all the time. The gap between IT infrastructure and IT applications is a little bit like the gap between litigators and business lawyers. We don't really talk to each other very much. We have very different practices. And consequently, there's the idea that we're all the same, we all know basically the same things is wrong. And also, it's that now that we're trying to get better at IT infrastructure, we're facing challenges on the application end. So we're basically having to reinvent healthcare IT, at least at the provider side, on the fly, and have been for the last few years.
Thanks, Darren. I think we often find ourselves in our practice advising clients on incident response plans and how they should account for prioritizing a response related to crown jewels, the most sensitive information and technology assets. Of course, that can include business confidential data, patient data, as you, I think, aptly just described, or it could also be systems that are actually providing or augmenting healthcare. We've also noticed crown jewels and the risks associated with them differ across industries. So I guess, Darren, if you don't mind just briefly discussing sort of what are the unique risks to crown jewels specifically do healthcare organizations face, and how threat actors are specifically focused on them that we may not all appreciate generally.
Well, I mean, I think one of the main things that people don't understand about healthcare IT is that they understand we have these large production databases. They've been in the doctor's office. They've seen the physician and the nurses working on essentially applications, filling in data about them. All that data goes into databases and it gets moved around various systems. But the area that's probably at greatest risk in most healthcare organizations are the reporting systems that come out of that. They tend to be essentially a little bit looser in terms of the underlying controls. And they actually use technologies that are more familiar to attackers, like various kinds of SQL database technologies. So attackers can get to the reporting and analysis databases more quickly than the production databases. And so you'll often see attacks that are most effective go towards those, so secondary and tertiary data sets. There are other things like essentially medical devices and those types of things, which get a lot of attention, but haven't been actively attacked except by primarily white hats. But we have seen essentially them going after the IT infrastructure and really drawing blood on these secondary databases, and that's where a lot of people need to pay more attention than they are now.
Thanks, Darren. Yeah, Lynn, please.
Yeah, I would just add to that one of the things we're seeing, particularly in our large academic medical centers, is that there is a sense of openness that faculty members, for example, physicians and other faculty members, are used to experiencing. And so I can imagine a challenge for Darren and his team and his colleagues is to achieve that collegiality amongst not just internally at the academic medical center, but also kind of across other academic medical centers. The other thing too that we see is research data tends to be kind of part of that. And that can be truly crown jewels, not just in the sense from a patient's perspective that there may be a lot of patient research subject type information that's included in that, but also too it could be a researcher's lifelong research that they're doing on a particular topic that can be incredibly valuable, not just to the organization, but certainly to that researcher themselves. And so when I kind of think across the spectrum of breaches that we've handled, in the healthcare sector, we've got that concern. And this is something that's really becoming in our world very somewhat, I won't say new and novel because it's been around forever, needless to say, but it's becoming in the world of ransomware and in the world of, these more sophisticated attacks that we're seeing on open environments. That may not be centralized in their IT and information security structure, that those are particularly open and a concern for an organization. One of the ways that we're able to work with our academic medical centers is to say, look, this research is really, really important. And if there are physicians that you can't get on board, for example, with multi-factor authentication or things along those lines, that when we give them an example of a research situation where research information has been breached, then it kind of gets their attention a little bit more. The other thing too we're seeing, and Darren touched on this a little bit, is that there are huge amounts of data that healthcare organizations not only have in their possession, which I think we all recognize that, but they are also being kind of congregated together, I guess, or put together in data lakes and things like that, that again, whether it's your quality department or if it's even your finance department, maybe looking at these data lakes and saying, okay, how is it that we can be more efficient? Or what part of the city do we need to put a diabetes clinic in, or whatever it is that data may show? And we've got just huge gatherings of protected health information that may be in one spot. And that's when I think about what our crown jewels are. Those are some of the crown jewels that I am in particularly concerned about and have seen threat actors go after, or at least try to get there through the means in which Darren talked about.
Thanks, Lynn. I hope my eyes didn't bug out when you were talking about data lakes of PHI, because that does sound chock full of risk for your clients. So Evan, hearing what Darren and Lynn just shared about healthcare industry and crown jewels, I was wondering if you had anything to offer about upfront communications planning. I know we're going to talk probably some more about just the mechanics of incident response, but anything you have to offer about what an organization could do upfront to plan for the possibility of having to communicate about an incident, especially as it relates to their crown jewels.
Yeah, absolutely, Ashton. The planning process is critical, and it really entails thinking through what are your communication channels today when everything's operational. And let's say you suffer a ransomware event and you've got encryption and say email is down or your website is offline. What are the channels you can use to deliver critical information to your stakeholders externally and then internally as well? The organizations that respond effectively to those types of incidents are the ones that have drilled on that, have already identified those channels, even if it's as simple as, do we have a Facebook page where we can say, hey, this happened, this is what we're able to do, this is what we're not able to do. Because it really is a unique circumstance that healthcare organizations and really hospitals specifically find themselves in, because there's a greater sense of public interest in one of these incidents, right? If you're a manufacturing company that manufactures widgets, sure, your customers are going to be concerned if you're no longer able to do that, but the community and the public is a little bit less invested. If you're a hospital that has to be, let's say, rerouting stroke and heart attack patients because of a ransomware event, getting that information to the community, not just to emergency services, but helping people understand what you're going through, what your recovery efforts are going to look like, what you are and aren't able to do, is really important to make sure the community is invested in your recovery. It's something I'll touch on a few times, I think, today, but hospitals really have, rightfully so, built a tremendous amount of goodwill over the last year for everything they've done to keep people safe. You know, I'm in New York, and there was that 6-month period where everyone's banging on pots and pans during the shift changes. And so there is a sense that communities will rally around organizations that are hit, but you can only really tap into that if you have channels to communicate with people, to engage your stakeholders and supporters, and make sure they understand what you're going through and how you're trying to remediate. So thinking through the channels by which you will reach people prior to an event is really what can set you up for, I mean, success is kind of it's not the right word because you're going through a cyber event, but can make that recovery process a lot less painful.
Thanks, Evan. And since we're talking about pain, although perhaps the entire forum is focused on a bit of pain, you know, I know we heard this morning about ransomware, the rise of ransomware, the continuing rise, but also ransomware has been particularly a challenging problem in the healthcare sector. I know the security firm Covington has noted recently that nearly 1/5 of all the ransomware attacks in Q4 of 2020 were in the healthcare sector from their perspective. And although ransomware is a critical concern across all industries, including healthcare, I know we're seeing a risk in data theft and extortion also increase, sometimes with ransomware, sometimes not, or including with the traditional ransomware threat actors who are just, you know, causing incidents just in order to monetize the theft of data. So I guess it would be helpful, maybe, Lynn, for you to start to sort of explain from your experience how you have typically advised organizations during an incident if the threat actor has either deployed ransomware or threatens to expose stolen healthcare data.
Yeah, so I can tell you this, our statistics at Baker line up very similarly to Coveware, and of course we work with Coveware on with ransom negotiations where it's warranted. And but in 2019, I'm going to go kind of back a little bit further. In 2019, I was very pleased to say that I didn't really have to pay ransom very often for my clients. A lot of my healthcare clients, particularly my large healthcare systems, had pretty good backups. They were segregated away from, you know, kind of their main systems. And so we were able to get back up and running, not without a little bit of pain, but we were able to do that because their IT professionals were, you know, had planned for these types of situations. Starting in about late 2019, that changed a bit, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, we started to see this exposure of data, the exfiltration of data. It wasn't just about encrypting systems in place and then demanding a ransom. It was exactly the threat that you described, Ashton, which is the exfiltration of data, and then the plan to expose it, and we're going to extort you for that. And if you think about the type of information that healthcare organizations have in their possession, it can be the most sensitive information that a person about a person, needless to say. So whether it's a disease process, a mental health condition, or something just very, very personal that may be contained within medical records, along with things like, with social security numbers and things along those lines, there is just a plethora of information that healthcare organizations have about their patients. So we started having to pay ransom, and sometimes it was because we needed to get back up and running as quickly as possible. Sometimes it was exactly this threat of what would our patients say to us if they knew that we could pay X number of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then, oh, by the way, most of my clients are nonprofits, and their balance sheets are for public consumption because they're nonprofit organizations, and they can see how much quote money they made in the previous 2 years. So $100,000 may not be very much to a large healthcare organization, and the patients may very well see that. Now, of course, what also comes from that is that we can get some threat intelligence, if you will, if we do pay the ransom and we're getting information back from the threat actors. A lot of times it helps our forensic firms be able to determine where the threat actor went. Does it corroborate with what they're seeing forensically, things along those lines. So there's a lot of value that we can bring from, if the price is right? We're not going to pay $40 million to get information back that may not be that valuable to us. But kind of going back on the research comment I made earlier, there may be research within your systems that you need to get back that you don't want exposed to the general, on the dark web, that might have that value around it. So it oftentimes becomes a value proposition for our clients, as to whether or not they need to pay the ransom. We have definitely seen more payment of ransom in 2020 and leading into 2021 than we had in the several previous years prior to that, when ransomware was really starting to be on the rise at that point. So we look at it on a case-by-case basis. I know we're going to talk about law enforcement later, but we work in conjunction with the FBI. We work with companies like Covington, Rete, and others to ensure that we're meeting OFAC requirements and things like that before we even allow for our clients to pay for the ransom. The FBI early on were very much like, don't pay the ransom. And now I think there's a recognition that sometimes, especially in the healthcare sector, you have to, if your systems are shut down, it's impacting operations and all of those horrible things that we can think about that could potentially impact patient care. So we handle it on a case-by-case basis, and sometimes and more frequently the ransom's having to be paid.
Thanks, Lynn. Similar to your experiences, we do find our clients struggling with the decision whether to pay or not pay, and it has become much more difficult to make that ultimate decision, whether it's in the real world or even in like a tabletop simulation. It's not cut and dry as much as I think it might have been perceived to be in the past. So I guess Evan, and then maybe followed by Darren, what practices can you share on this dilemma and what you have seen that may be specifically unique to the healthcare industry? I guess just to build on what Lynn shared.
Yeah, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with Lynn that generally this is a case-by-case determination. I think one of the things that's important when evaluating whether to make a payment is also understanding the evolving tactics of these threat actors. There was, in the beginning, it was just the encryption events. Now it's data exfiltration and the threat of posting it on a shame site. I mean, we like to say that these are basically criminal cartels with PR departments. They're talking to reporters. But it's actually even gone further than that. And we've seen this in the healthcare space a lot, where now they're using the information they may have exfiltrated about patients to contact patients directly and say, hey, we stole your data from this organization. You need to tell them to pay or we're going to publish it on the dark web. And that's a really scary thing for people to go through, particularly if you're talking about elderly patients, don't understand this world. And so, I don't ever really think it's my place to directly tell a client whether they should pay, but it is my place to help them think through what's going to happen if they do or they don't. What kind of questions are they going to get? And that piece about the added leverage now that these threat actors have on organizations and the fact that they're utilizing, mass email or even call centers to contact people and extort downstream from the client is something that needs to be built into the decision making there and really needs to be a factor. And if you're not going to pay, to Lynn's point, what are you going to tell people? who ask and say, hey, this organization that is, reaching out to me directly said that you had the ability to stop my data from getting posted on the web and you didn't. Explain that to me. So it really just has added another layer of challenge, particularly for healthcare organizations, because this is about as sensitive as data gets. People are kind of used to social security numbers getting out there at this point. It's happened so much. All of our social security numbers essentially are out there. But specific patient data, as Lynn said, mental health records, those are still really, really sensitive. And it does increase the pressure on organizations to at least consider a payment to prevent the leakage of that data.
Thanks, Evan. There's also been, especially during the pandemic, there's been widely reported spikes in ransomware attacks in the healthcare sector, leading, I know, the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, or Cyber and Infrastructure, and FBI to release a joint advisory on threat actor TTPs and indicators of compromise in October of this past year. Certain strands of malware have been identified and promulgated throughout the industry to look out for. But these attacks can also be severe, as we saw in September 2020, when a patient in Germany, at least as reported, became the first known fatality from a ransomware attack when they had to be taken to another city for treatment. So I guess, Darren, from the perspective of the actual healthcare providers, knowing that ransomware cannot just impact data itself in sort of the more traditional sense, but it can start impacting the actual provision of health services. I was wondering if you have a perspective of how organizations should think about that risk and whether that also would play into, or how it plays into, the decision to pay or not to pay.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of years ago, about 5 years ago, ransomware, became a major concern. And what happened was there was a spike of it. It was fairly localized, not very professionally done. Ransoms were low. Bitcoin cost a lot less back then. And so it didn't seem like, we weren't really sure what was going to come of it, whether it was going to fall off. And my take on it is that what happened was the adversary got a lot more professional. I don't think it has that much to do with COVID. I'd be surprised if it did. I think it's just coincidental. I think the adversary got more professional, and they started using every tool at hand. Evan mentions some of those. One of those is the taking over the printers. It's pretty easy to map to a bunch of printers and then printing a bunch of ransom notes. That's a way to make sure that this thing hits the papers as quickly as possible. They figured out that most organizations, especially healthcare organizations, which are lightly staffed in IT, relatively speaking, and heavily data laden, are going to have weaknesses, and they're just going to prod on as many of them as they can until they find one that makes the healthcare organization yell. And so wouldn't surprise me if 2 years from now they're basically turning off people's air conditioning at clinics and those types of things. If they think they can get away with it, they will. The thing is, encrypting a backup of a petabyte of data or half a petabyte of data is really hard for an attacker to do. You really have to work hard. But stealing a gigabyte of data is very easy. It's just painfully easy. And if you just happen to get the right gigabyte, you're going to have you're going to have your adversary your attackee over a barrel. So, my expectation is they will prod every single vulnerability in our IT infrastructure and our operational infrastructure at as many organizations as they can for as long as they can get away with it. And so to me, they're good enough now to where they'll pivot to anything. And that's the part that's scary about this. 2 years ago, they didn't look that great. The malware, they were basically fighting each other most of the time. Now there's enough of the ransomware gangs out there that are essentially professional software development firms, that it's actually really difficult to imagine how we as a industry, and frankly other industries too, but I think ours in particular, are going to be able to manage that level of threat. I've never been more discouraged than I am right now in terms of our ability to beat that back.
Thanks, Darren. So Lynn, oh, go ahead, Lynn.
I was just going to say, about 13 months ago when we first went out for the pandemic here in the U.S., some of the threat actor groups kind of said, truce, we're not going to deploy ransomware on healthcare. We realized, we're kind of all in this together type thing. And I think that lasted for about 2 weeks. And I wasn't doing ransomware for 2 weeks. And then, and then they came back under attack. And then really to Darren's point, what we're seeing is, many times our clients think we have been specifically targeted by this ransomware group. And what we're seeing is exactly what Darren described, is it is almost a spray across the industries, plural, not just healthcare industry, looking for that weak link. When I talk to clients about it, I talk about and some of you may have heard me say this before, it's the parking lot full of cars, and they're going and checking every door to see which handle is open and looking for the easy opportunity to get in. Now, yes, they are more sophisticated, certainly, than they have been in the past. But I still think they're looking for the easier ways to get in. Sometimes it's targeted. We did notice early in COVID, some of our academic medical centers and academic institutions that were doing COVID research were under particular fire at that point in time. And so we felt like those were probably targeted attacks. But by and large, they may know about your organization enough to be able to know how much in ransom to ask for. And they may know a little bit about your organization to know that you are kind of a big player or a small player. But we don't find that there's a lot of targeted attacks, that they really are looking for that crime of opportunity to get into the health system or to the academic medical center so that they can, essentially extort the money from you.
Lynn, thanks. You had mentioned earlier that in 2019, it almost seemed like the ransomware events from your experience were actually decreasing, and then then eventually there was a spike going into this past year. I guess given that and what you just shared, do you have a view of whether healthcare organizations are starting to take this risk more seriously? And if so, how is that manifesting when it comes to incident response?
I think they are taking it more seriously. I think the CISA announcements late last year in October definitely got a lot of people's attention. We at Baker, and I'm sure others across the industry, we had Project Trick or Treat because it was over the Halloween weekend that we anticipated a number of our healthcare clients were going to get attacked. We partnered with our forensic partners as well as our communications partners to ensure that we were ready to go that weekend and over the course of the next couple of weeks. Definitely got a lot of people's attention. And having said that, though, I think Darren's point is very well taken. We find that compared to other regulated industries, that IT is not, that's not the income generator at healthcare organizations. I mean, it is an absolute necessity, especially in this day and age of electronic medical records and all of the electronic devices that are used in healthcare. But it is still a cost center. And so they have to manage budgets and have to be efficient and all of those types of things. And I'm saying this because I was a lawyer in a hospital and certainly know that as well. And so I think just finding sophisticated CISOs like Darren that are really at the top of their game, I think you're challenging other industries that are looking for exactly the same people. And I personally think healthcare is special. I think we have a special place in the community. Obviously, we take care of patients. We are an absolute critical infrastructure, part of every community. And so we have to find the best of the best, but we're competing with Facebook and we're competing with the Department of Defense, and we're competing with organizations that can truly pay a lot more than a number of our healthcare organizations can. So I think there's a real challenge there to find those sophisticated professionals and frankly, finding consulting partners and spending the dollars on that when there's a lot of competition for dollars within healthcare organizations.
Thanks, Lynn. And then given that there's that competition, it seems like perhaps more planning up front could at least help mitigate some risk when you have to respond. So I guess, Evan, you touched on this briefly in sort of your introductory comments that it's not about the event, it's about how you respond to the event. So I guess, do you have any more to add on this part of the conversation for ransomware, especially in the healthcare industry, and actions organizations could take to sort of prepare ahead of time for that event?
Yeah, absolutely, Ashton. I think there's been an evolution, and Lynn was touching on this, and I do think organizations are taking these specific threats a lot more seriously than they were in the past. I think the concept that, well, it can't happen to me, there's got to be 500 hospitals bigger than me that are on their list before they get to me, I think people are starting to realize that's not the case. But what I think is important is a lot of organizations have sort of a general crisis plan, like what happens if, power goes out. But understanding the uniqueness of ransomware and cyber incidents specifically, and really building a tailored response plan that pulls in all of the what ifs that could happen. What if we have to transition to paper? What if email is down? What if we don't have a way to communicate externally? What if phones are down? We had a client whose phones were taken offline for 2 weeks by a ransomware attack. How do you get information to patients who were expecting to come in tomorrow and have an appointment? So building a plan that's specific to that, and then not just building it. It's not enough to write a plan and stick it on the shelf in a binder. It's really important to test it, and test it with the people who actually are going to have a role to play in response. Testing those channels of communication, testing the operational response. How are administrators communicating with doctors and nurses if systems are down? How are we sharing information if it's a hospital system among various hospitals? All of those things it's important to do that live. And we do that regularly with our clients, run simulations that really do walk them through a true-to-life ransomware attack, up to and including, dummying up the name and shame page that Conti or Revel or whoever is running, to put them through their paces and help them understand the decisions they're going to have to make through the life cycle of an event. And really, I think that regular drilling is what makes people a little bit more confident in their response if they're hit with an incident. And it's not asking, what do we do? It's activating a plan that people already understand. So I find that, it's creating a tailored solution from a communications and operational standpoint to respond to this type of incident. But then it's just regularly drilling on it and make sure people understand what to do and understand the channels and tools they have available to reach their stakeholders, both internally and externally. And understand also, what generally do these events feel like? I think, again, there's a greater understanding of how these events play out. But again, you don't want your internal people saying, well, why can't we just turn everything back on? If they can understand the nature of a forensic investigation, the nature of understanding systems are secure, deploying endpoint monitoring, whatever that process looks like for a given organization, the better they'll be able to adjust to a new normal in an interim period if there is a ransomware attack and they do have to adapt the way they work.
Thanks, Evan. And sort of to build on those points, Lynn, I was hoping maybe you could comment briefly. I mean, clearly the healthcare industry is a heavily regulated industry for multiple sources. I think what is top of mind, and I'm seeing this in the questions that we're getting from the audience, is HIPAA. So I was wondering if you could just briefly comment on any trends you're seeing as far as HIPAA compliance issues and how that intersects, and then any advice you may have to the audience about how to incorporate in sort of those HIPAA-related obligations, especially if you're a business associate who has an incident that you could share with the group.
Yeah, I would say kind of two things around that is we definitely see a lot of regulatory scrutiny, both at the federal level and at the state level, around how an organization responds based on HIPAA. You all may know that state regulators have the enforcement authority under HIPAA to be able to also investigate, not just the Office for Civil Rights. And we've definitely seen state AG starting to kind of step into this space. I was on a call yesterday with the Texas AG for a client here locally who, while she's always very, very courteous to our Texas clients, if there is a business associate that's outside of state, she will not hesitate to investigate them, for the good people of the state of Texas. But so we do definitely see a kind of that regulatory scrutiny. From a HIPAA compliance standpoint, I mean, HIPAA has been around since 2003. That's the privacy rule. The security rule has been around since 2005. The breach notification rule has been around since 2009. These are not new laws. But we have seen a bit of an evolution, particularly in the last couple of years, as healthcare organizations start to kind of challenge the Office for Civil Rights and saying, hey, you guys, you are overstepping your bounds. Business associates are challenging OCR, you're overstepping your bounds. And interestingly, the courts around the country are agreeing. Recently, MD Anderson challenged the Office for Civil Rights here in the Fifth Circuit here in Texas about, felt like they had overstepped their bounds. The Fifth Circuit agreed. Now, some of y'all around the states might say, well, of course the Fifth Circuit agreed. That's a conservative court. But we've had courts on the on the East Coast who agreed with a business associate that the OCR had overstepped their bounds in the PsyOx matter. So it's very interesting to kind of see the court slapping down a federal agency. We are a little bit in flux right now with the new administration in place. Unless something happened this morning, we do not yet have a new OCR director in place. That hasn't been put in place by the new HHS secretary. So I think it's going to be interesting to kind of see what may be continued from the prior administration. We've seen things like healthcare organizations getting penalized for access to medical records, so not having open access to medical records for their patients. When all of these years since 2003, we've been really on the privacy side of stuff. We've been trying to make sure that we have appropriate authorization, and now there's been 17 resolution agreements that come down from OCR to healthcare organizations for not providing, quote, access to records. That was started in the Obama administration, continued on through the Trump administration, and we expect that will probably continue into the Biden administration. So there definitely has been some of that information blocking rules, which I'm sure Darren's a big headache for him over at Johns Hopkins, are starting to kind of come online at this point, which with electronic medical records, and again, this has to do with access, are critically important. So the regulators are in this space, and they are not afraid to penalize healthcare organizations. And I think even though we've seen a little bit of pushback on that, we anticipate that trend is probably going to continue, and it's very difficult for healthcare to push back and say, federal government, I know you're our regulator. We're not going to agree to a settlement with you guys. We're going to go fight you in court. It's just a really, really tough proposition for most of our clients.
Thanks, Lynn. Recognize we only have a few minutes left. I guess what would be helpful is to perhaps briefly just speak about the pandemic some more, and that is, have there been any lessons learned thus far? I mean, we're now 14, at least in the United States, going into our 14th month generally of a general response to the pandemic. Any lessons learned for the healthcare industry from the pandemic, and then specifically any that could be incorporated into incident response? Perhaps, Evan, if you could go first, at least from a communicator standpoint, have there been any changes, any lessons that should be applied?
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to something that I mentioned earlier. I've heard it said nobody ever feels bad for the victim of a cyber attack or from a ransomware event. And I can just say from firsthand experience, that's not the case with hospitals and healthcare organizations. There is that bank of reputational goodwill, and there is a desire in the community to support these organizations and support the people that are on the front lines of the pandemic every day. But it also adds some imperatives to your communication strategy. You really do need to be a little bit more transparent. You really don't want to look like you're hiding the ball from patients and constituents. So I think I've seen more organizations be able to navigate this successfully, almost because of the pandemic, because there is a sense of understanding for everything that everyone in a hospital is doing for people right now. But also, you can, Warren Buffett said, it takes a lifetime to build a reputation and a day to destroy it. And it really is true in incident response and communications, that if you're saying things that aren't true, or you're trying to minimize the significance of an incident, you can blow all that goodwill in a day. So it requires a really measured response that brings together people like me and people like Lynn and Ashton, you and Darren, to make sure everybody is speaking consistently and engaging with their community in the right manner.
Thanks, Evan. So I guess in the remaining time, it'd be great if we could just go around Maybe Darren, starting with you, if you have 30 seconds or less, any last minute advice for the audience?
No, I just want to ask the bar why there's still such a thing as Bitcoin. And I'm not going to get on my soapbox, but I'm still puzzled why we can have a currency that essentially has, to my mind, is largely behind the current, ransomware chaos, and that it's still around is a puzzle to me.
Thanks, Darren. Lynn?
Yeah, I would just say, and I say this whenever I have an audience of any type involving healthcare organizations, is get back to basics. As I mentioned earlier, HIPAA has been around for nearly 20 years now, and there is an expectation that healthcare organizations, particularly well-funded, large healthcare organizations, know what they're supposed to comply with. So get back to those basics, things like security risk analysis, training and education of your staff, working your incident response plans, tabletop drills, which healthcare does very, very well. So all of those things, it is pretty basic. And those are the types of check the box things that the Office for Civil Rights and other regulators look for.
Thanks, Lynn. And finally, Evan?
I think, I would align completely with Lynn, but understand that expectations placed on healthcare organizations are different than those placed on, a large publicly traded company. And if anyone's interested, I've got a quick little brochure with some best practices that healthcare organizations can follow. So reach out if you're interested. Shameless plug. Thanks, Ashton.
Well, thank you everyone very much for participating. Bruce?
Thanks, Ashton. Evan, Darren, Lynn, thank you so much for a great panel. We really appreciate it. Great topic too. So we have a little bit longer break, about 9 minutes. We'll be back with kind of a new panel for this conference. We're doing a panel, it's called Women in Incident Response. I think you're gonna find it very interesting. We'll see you back here at 11:55 Eastern Time. Thank you.